This video is brought to you in part by HelloFresh. More on them in a bit. Would you believe me if I told you there are 13 Croc games? I wouldn't. Nowadays, a footnote in the evolution of 3D platformers, you might not even know what this 1997 game was, or if you do, you likely remember it as the one with weird tank controls. And yet this PS1 and Sega Saturn game, I swear to God, might be one of the most important games to ever exist. A game made by the tiny UK studio responsible for creating Star Fox, and a game whose initial pitch to Nintendo back in 1994 allegedly helped inspire the creation of Super Mario 64. Allegedly. I want to say it one more time just for those in the back. Very, very big allegedly on that. We'll get there. The first Croc game became one of the PS1's best-selling titles ever, putting up numbers comparable to the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games, Spyro, and more. It spawned a whole series of sequels and spin-offs, none of which performed nearly as well because they weren't one of the only 3D platformers to exist at the time of their release. Again, you're probably still confused about how there's more than even just Croc 1 and 2, and trust me, I very much was too. So let's talk about all of these games. Let's talk about this series that you probably forgot existed, or maybe didn't realize was a series, that almost became an almost multimedia empire. Almost. Let's talk about the Croc television show that almost happened, and let's talk about the lost 14th Croc game. I cannot believe those are words I said. You might be familiar with the name Argonaut software, particularly if you happen to be a Nintendo enjoyer. Founded in the UK in 1982 by a 16-year-old kid named Jez San, Argonaut has the distinction of being the first major Western developer to formally work directly with and at Nintendo. Well, I say major, but Argonaut at the time was no more than a dozen young dudes working out of a single house, which is what makes this partnership with the closed-doors, undisputed king of gaming at the time even more unlikely. Argonaut first gained the attention of Nintendo at the summer 1990 Consumer Electronics Show, when Jez San showed the company how his team had broken the Game Boy's copyright protection system while making their own unlicensed game. The Game Boy wouldn't release in Argonaut's home region of Europe for another 3 months. Oh, and by the way, the demo they were showing the Nintendo executives was the first three-dimensional game ever made for the handheld. Just want to say, once again, the Game Boy was not even out yet in Europe, and a bunch of European teenagers and 20-somethings had not only hacked the system, they had blown Nintendo's minds. It shouldn't be a surprise that almost immediately after the expo ended, San was flown out to Japan to meet directly with Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Before long, some of Argonaut's employees had moved across the globe to work directly inside Nintendo on what would become Star Fox. More than that, they weren't just working on Star Fox, they were working on the hardware that made Star Fox possible. See, San leveraged the connections with British game industry veterans that he'd made over the years, dude's only 24 at the time by the way, in order to produce the Super FX chip for the Super Nintendo, the chip that certain game cartridges would utilize to allow for more advanced two-dimensional special effects, or even render 3D polygons on what was meant to be a sprite-based console. It was an unprecedented change of tone from Nintendo to work so openly with a Western studio, let alone on a state-of-the-art hardware innovation for their brand new console. But Argonaut was different. When it came to improving the SNES hardware, they were not only welcomed, they were allowed. That's a reference none of you are gonna get. Why did I make that?
Weapons are not only welcomed, they're allowed.
Alright, so I hear some of you asking, Jonathan, what does this have to do with Croc? And that's a little informal and a little weird to ask it that way, but this Super FX chip was the keystone in a lengthy working relationship between Argonaut and Nintendo. Or, at least, it was supposed to be. The two studios did continue working together, with Argonaut even working on a virtual reality system for Nintendo, a different and supposedly far more advanced system than the Virtual Boy that Nintendo ended up going with. But then, something weird happened. In 1994, one of the animators at Argonaut threw together a small animation test using the Super FX chip to showcase what Yoshi might look like running around in a three-dimensional Super Mario level. Nobody knew quite what to call this sort of idea yet, but it apparently blew minds at Argonauts, so San brought this idea to Shigeru Miyamoto and other Nintendo executives as a pitch for some kind of Yoshi racing game. According to Croc's lead designer Nick Cusworth, Nintendo's response was very quiet, and shortly thereafter the company began cutting ties with Argonaut. Perhaps by sheer coincidence, perhaps because they didn't appreciate their characters being used in even a pitch without their permission ahead of time, or perhaps because they were now being outcompeted by essentially a bunch of kids that were also developing for several competing platforms. Whatever the case, the relationship between the two companies seemed to fall apart almost overnight. Argonaut's VR system was scrapped in favor of the Virtual Boy. Star Fox 2 was cancelled despite being ostensibly finished. Nintendo hired the Argonaut employees that were already living in Japan out from under Argonaut itself, and allegedly, the Nintendo 64 Star Fox game, which was now being developed by those employees and by Nintendo in-house, reused much of the code from Argonaut's Star Fox 2, all without Argonaut receiving the royalties it would have been owed for those projects, leaving the company to develop Yoshi Racing into its own idea starring a similar green lizard character, Croc. The company's founder, Jez San, in recent years has been pretty open about his belief that this prototype directly inspired Super Mario 64, saying that the latter, quote, had the look and feel of our Yoshi game, even going as far to say that Miyamoto later saw him at a trade show and apologized for not greenlighting the game, and thanked him for the idea to do a 3D platform game. Afterwards, everybody in the room clapped. Alright, so this is where things start to get hazy. According to San, this Yoshi pitch was put together in early 1994 and may have been an actual playable demo that they had deliberately designed. According to Nick Cusworth, however, it was closer to an animation test and was put together as a fun, spare time kind of idea around the time that Argonaut was finishing up a different game ahead of that game's December release. Also, according to San, except this time in 1997, right when Croc was releasing, Nintendo outright told him during the Yoshi Racing pitch that they had a similar idea in production already, and he himself in this interview sort of downplayed the idea that this pitch had had any major inspiration on Mario 64, or that any inspiration was purely coincidental. So where does the truth lie? Well, after that massive Nintendo leak and data dump in 2020, it was discovered that Mario 64 officially began production on September 7th, 1994, right around the time that Argonaut would have been finishing up its December game. Right around the time of this animation test, according to Cusworth's recollection. So, in either scenario, there's actually a chance that the game that later became Croc had a direct influence and inspiration on the game that revolutionized three-dimensional camera control on one of the most important games to ever exist. When you know the sorts of inspiration that Miyamoto mentions taking from his surroundings when it comes to his idea process, there's actually no question that Proto Croc was in his mind when it came time to move from idea into production. That means that there's almost certainly at least a sliver of Croc DNA in Mario 64, although we'll never quite know what that sliver might be. That is wild. But I can't say I believe that Miyamoto ever came up to Jez San and said, "Thanks for the idea to make a 3D platformer." There's just no way. The guy's story had already changed over the years, and you know for a fact that a Sega-affiliated magazine would have jumped on the idea that the company's arch-rival stole from a game that was now releasing on a Sega system. Toss in the fact that Nintendo's next console, at the time codenamed Project Reality and later known as the N64, was in development as a fully three-dimensional system before even Star Fox 1 released. No, I don't think that conversation happened. Whatever the case might be, inspiration or not, it's incredibly likely that Croc was the first proper prototype of a 3D platformer on consoles, and certainly no later than the second if you're counting Jumping Flash. Without Nintendo's backing, however, and having had some staff outright poached by Nintendo, the small team at Argonaut didn't end up being the first to release a 3D platformer. Published by Fox Interactive, because every major media company was trying to open a game publishing division back then, Croc Legend of the Gobbos came out in September 1997, 3 years after this Yoshi pitch, over a year after Mario 64, and it was still one of the PS1's earliest 3D platformers. And also, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say it was one of the only 3D platformers on the Sega Saturn. Like, I'm sure there are probably 2 or 3 others, let me know some of them in the comments, and Knights doesn't count, so don't even try. As I'd said before, Croc sold incredibly well, in part due to being on the cutting edge of PS1 platformers, and also apparently in part due to Croc himself being cute. Apparently during early marketing tests, Fox said that women really loved his little backpack because they had one just like that. So what began as a clear attempt to replace Yoshi's shell made Croc a fashion icon that crossed the usual gaming gender gap that existed at the time. According to Jez Sand, in fact, later an employee from Rare came up to him at E3 and thanked him for the idea to use a backpack in Banjo-Kazooie. I can't even. That's not true. Probably everybody clapped. The story in Croc is honestly just as cute as his backpack, and I mean that genuinely. This game's got a really weird appeal to it where it just feels pure and wholesome, like you really just want to root for this game. The orphan baby crocodile is found and raised by these weird fuzzballs known as Gobbos, living in harmony and moistening cows. That's real. That's in the manual. This is why we root for this game. Anyway, they live in harmony until one day the evil Baron Dante captures a bunch of the Gobbos and begins assaulting the islands with his magic powers. Powers that include grunting and turning goats into the worst kind of Elden Ring invaders. This game is amazing, except it's not very good. But before we dig deep into Croc Legend of the Gobbos, let me tell you about how you can gobbo these nutritious meals from HelloFresh. For those that may not know, I haven't really talked about it much, but I've actually been working in my spare time to get back into better shape, because doing this is kind of like a regular desk job where you're sitting a lot of the day, except the boss you hate is actually yourself. Of course, one of the best ways to hit those fitness goals is to keep better tabs on your diet, and HelloFresh is a meal kit service that not only offers healthier options such as vegetarian or pescatarian meals, it provides you with pre-portioned ingredients so you know exactly how much you're making and eating. There are over 50 meal options to choose from each and every week, with a bunch of seasonal rotations, and you can choose how many meals you'd like to receive for that week to help customize it to your own changing schedule. Plus, each meal kit comes with an easy-to-follow recipe card, so there's very little fussing around with prep time, stressing about what to make so much that you then just order takeout anyway, buying too much at the store that you end up wasting or throwing away. HelloFresh is all simply just a breeze. For me, it ended up being cheaper, faster, more reliable, and most importantly, really tasty. And I think you'll feel the same, so make sure to click the link down below or go to HelloFresh.com and use the code POGGOLDEN-May16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts across 6 HelloFresh boxes, and that includes free shipping. Thanks again to the fine folks at HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video, and speaking of, let's get back to it. The reason that most folks don't remember Croc nowadays more than as a passing memory or an, oh yeah, that one, is that Croc kinda sucks to play. Understandably, considering that the PS1 didn't get its DualShock analog sticks until about a month before the game's release, so our big green friend here controls like a big green tank. I'm talking moving forward in hesitated little steps, pressing left or right to try and turn yourself to just the right position so that you can press forward again and move in that exact direction before stopping and readjusting again. I'm talking the L1 and R1 buttons are just a little shimmy button. It's rough, but it's manageable for the first of the game's 5 worlds. This first world? Actually really fun. So in each level, it's sort of this semi-freeform adventure where you explore a series of different rooms trying to rescue all 6 Gobbos in that level. Sometimes rooms circle back to the start, other times you'll find a key that allows you to backtrack and progress through another area. If you press circle while moving, you'll do this sick flip move, and I just need to make sure you've seen it at least once, and Croc continued to kind of shock me with how many very little mechanics it introduced. Almost immediately in World 1, you find out that Croc can climb certain contextual walls. Later, you've got the same sort of monkey bar traversal as Mario 64. At one point, this game just drops in some actually kind of fluid underwater swimming mechanics that feel Tomb Raider-esque. At the time, this was all knocked as derivative, but when you take into account the context that this game kinda came first but came out late to the party, it's far more impressive. Hell, believe it or not, the little crystals that Croc picks up and loses when he gets hit actually inspired Sonic's rings. Don't Google that, just trust me. And in this first world, and exclusively this first world actually, the game feels catered around the tanky controls. Wide platforms to give you a good margin of error, and Croc automatically grabs onto ledges if you're close enough but miss the jump. It avoids too much precision and instead focuses on that sense of exploration and discovery, encouraging you to find all 5 of the special crystals to open the end of level door and get the better second exit gong thing, looking for secret bonus rooms, and really leveraging how pretty this game looks. Like, obviously it's got the PS1 texture warping thing going on, but rooms are kept small enough that I can't recall any of the system's trademark distance fog outside of 1 or 2 of the bonus missions where it's meant to be a dark, foggy level. The skyboxes are pixelated as hell, but look super colorful. The cave interiors have that awesome red lava underglow to them. This game rarely looks 1997. Pretty much as soon as World 2 hits though, the game starts to get downright mean. I'm talking ice physics in the second world mean, tight platforming onto footholds barely bigger than Croc himself, which also have slippery edges and tend to disappear or constantly rotate mean. I'm talking sometimes the regular gems you see in the levels are actually secretly one of the 5 special crystals that opens the end of level gate, so you have to pick up every gem you see just in case you want to save all your Gobbo friends mean, even though you lose all your gems anyway if you take a single hit, so why go out of your way with bad platforming to put yourself in danger for just a couple gems mean, with the added mean bonus that the special crystals don't count towards your gem total. So if you have 0 gems on hand and really need to find one so you don't die the next time the bad platforming or Croc's inconsistent attack hitboxes betray you, you'd better hope you didn't accidentally find one of the special ones. I'm even talking bosses with such janky hitboxes that you're just as likely to take damage as deal it when trying to do your puny tail swipe mean. What begins as a genuinely impressive, promising game even despite its control scheme, thanks in part to a clear design around that shortcoming, then for some reason leans into those shortcomings to ensure a frustrating experience. And it's just a total shame, because the actual world design is clearly inspired even if it hits the usual grass, ice, desert, castle tropes on the surface. The enemy designs, for example, are so out there that you can't help but love them. I mean, what the f*** is Ballistic Meg? Look at that, what is that? The level names are usually bad, corny puns or references that work better here for me because the game is so innocent rather than in your face with it like something like a Gex or Duke Nukem were. And the music? Straight up slaps. I mean, listen to this. Wait, hold on, is that? No, I have it on good authority that Koji Kondo thanked Croc's composer during Fatboy Slim's set at Coachella for the inspiration behind Mario 3D World's theme. Croc might just be the single most influential game in history, I'm just saying. This game is actually a fever dream at times. Again, Ballistic Meg. Or just look at some of the game's cutscenes, they are hilarious. Like when you beat the game, the Gobbos build a gigantic statue of Croc and he just stares with his stupid dead eyes out into the abyss with this power stance like he's their new god. I love stuff like this. Croc finds a way to have peak lovable underdog energy so often and it still just kinda throws it away. I'll admit that I ended up using the game's password system to see the bonus levels, which unlock if you save all the Gobbos in a world, and that includes the game's true ending. I could not be bothered to deal with all of the frustrating level design, and spoilers, that's gonna be a running theme with this series. Whoops. It turns out, by the way, that at the end of each bonus level is... That's just a fucking jiggy. When did Banjo come out? Oh my god. Okay, so if you collect all of the jiggies, you unlock the bonus world, which remixes one level from each of the first 4 worlds before culminating in a final boss fight against Baron Dante, except now he's made of crystals. Credit where it's due, this actually is a cool fight once you know what you're supposed to do. It takes the end of level gongs that you've been hitting all game and makes them the weapons that you use to defeat Dante. You've just got to hit them all fast enough so that all 4 are resonating at once, which comes close to requiring that you physically cut corners. Or if you don't realize what you're supposed to do, you can just run around in circles using the rotating platforms until they start to desync and rise up above Baron. It's pretty cool. Look, it's better than the real final boss where you're expected to run away from attacks without being able to see them thanks to how this game's camera works. And when the credits roll, Argonaut is nice enough to give you a warning that Croc will return. I don't even need to make the joke this time, that is just marvelous. Soiled or not, the promise is clearly here with Croc, and I find myself wanting to like the game more than I really can. The question would be, could Argonaut get it right when Croc did return? No, I actually think Croc 2 is worse. Originally teased to release in late 1998 according to the first game's manual, that's a pretty bold decision, Croc 2 didn't end up coming out until August of the following year. I'm just going to assume because Argonaut was busy producing Buck Bumble. Honestly, that extra year of time would hopefully help things. 3D platform game design was a fluid, evolving beast during this time, and perhaps after inspiring so many games itself, it was time for Croc to take some inspiration back. Instead, it took a fat check, which I can understand. Croc 2 was positioned by Fox to be a big deal, with a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign and a brand deal with lifesavers, featuring the gummies as in-game items. And not like items that you would eat to regain health or something normal, no, they are used as trampolines. Fox truly did believe that despite Croc's average at best reception, its sales made it an iconic brand that could continue for years. In fact, around this time, they were starting to explore the idea of making a Croc cartoon. The problem was, gaming was on its way to moving on from this wholesome, quirky sort of platformer, especially on PlayStation consoles as opposed to Nintendo, and also this game isn't very good, off of the back of the first game that people generally recognized even back then as not very good. Croc 2 does improve in theory. Gone are the tank controls, with the camera instead following dynamically behind you as you move and navigate what's now an interconnected open world full of smaller mission-based levels. Total sidebar for a second, the world has no map, and there's no mission screen a la Spyro that tells you your completion for different levels, which is just great in overworlds that tend to look pretty samey and can only draw about 30 feet ahead of you, with missions that are given to you by Gobbos that are essentially the exact same character. They even refer to themselves as one entity, only ever calling themselves Gobbo. Pretty sure Miyamoto thanked Jez Sand for the inspiration behind modern Paper Mario's homogeneous toads, too. The level designs themselves tend to be far improved, with a lot of varied mission ideas, or at least varied explanations for them. On the other hand, they are all filler. This game is just packed to the brim with the Gobbos asking Croc to retrieve their stolen sandwich, or defeat Baron Dante's troops in a boat race, or make some ginger ale for the Gobbos. It's all super low stakes. At first, I found this all charming, in the same way that Croc 1's weird energy had charmed me, but it kinda soured once I realized the entire game was going nowhere. The plot of Croc 2 is that thanks to some sort of ritual sacrifice, Baron Dante is back, and he's attacked the Gobbo version of Tails. Croc, in a completely unrelated part of the story, finds a message in a bottle from his parents, and his Gobbo friends fling him to another island so that he can try and reunite with his real family, and then Croc does a bunch of unrelated errands for different villages of Gobbos before suddenly you fight Dante and the game ends. Obviously, we're not playing this game for the articles, though I've got to say that the quirky dialogue did get some chuckles out of me until I realized that walking near a Gobbo activates the conversation again. It's not tied to an interact button, so that's just great. But better is that the game's air-quote improved camera cannot follow Croc well at all. When Croc jumps, every single time that Croc jumps, the camera struggles to follow his lightning-fast jump arc, so it jerks upward after you're already near the top of the screen, and then has to jerk back down because you've already essentially landed on the platform that you now couldn't see because it had jerked up above you. Other improvements have this same sort of asterisk. Croc's moveset is expanded a bit, mainly by way of purchasable power-ups that you get from Swap Meet Pete's shop. That was first try, say that one 5 times fast. He even gives you a debit card to store the gems you pick up in the levels, but the problem is that these power-ups are all single-use, and only usable on context-sensitive markers. 3 of these such power-ups are Lifesaver's bounce pads, which all have slightly different jump heights or effects when you bounce onto them, but at least in my experience, you could just buy the expensive one, which is only a little bit more expensive, and just keep using that one and it would work for all of them. There's no really good way to know which color lifesaver you'd need in a level until you've done the level once, so you generally can't complete a level on the first go unless you stock up and hope you have the right one, which really great design. You could say it's for replayability's sake, but these levels are so long and kind of dreadfully boring that you would never want to play them twice. There's also a weird little robo-gobbo that you can pilot to pick up gems when you see a similar context-sensitive pad. He's one-time use too, which, great. That leaves only the most useful power-up left, the only one that actually stays with you, a permanent health upgrade. Except in this game, gems aren't sonic rings. When you take damage, you lose one of those hearts, and those hearts are also your live counter, so when you run out and game over, you still come back with only 3 hearts no matter what your maximum is. The only ways to get more hearts are to find them, usually tucked away in part of a level where it's still kind of a risk to go for it in the first place, or to collect 100 gems just like in Croc 1. Except each level has exactly 100 gems here, and most levels require those lifesavers or the Gobbo bot to get all 100, so you're essentially never going to get a heart that way, not without losing at least as many hearts in the duration of these often drawn-out levels. Even if you buy another heart container to increase your maximum, that does not refill. Why? And since you often can't really see where you're jumping, or you have to jump across these finicky momentum-based ropes that can actually swing you too far over the platform you're trying to land on, it's just as easy as in Croc 1 to fall into lava and take a hit, or maybe even multiple hits. In some of the minecart levels, it's even easier. Don't get me wrong, like in Croc 1, a game over isn't the end of the world since you start right before the level you were just in, but when even what's supposed to be level 2 is this lengthy multi-phase level with a bunch of minecart pathways, you don't want to have to do that all over again, especially since your progress resets when you exit a level, even if you've finished it. Didn't get all 5 of the special colored crystals? Well, you gotta do the whole level over again if you want the Gobbo Grammy or whatever the hell that is. I can't care how novel some of these levels end up being. Chasing down a train or freeing a bunch of Gobbos that then knock down trees and create platforms for you to progress further, that stuff acts as a really cool visual set piece, a fun anchor throughout some levels, but it's not enough to make up for the level design that's often just as frustrating as Croc 1's for very different reasons. At least Croc 1 can get a pass for a lot of the levels being shorter and for being so early to the platformer game. By 1999, in a game that Argonaut and Fox are hoping sells another 2+ million copies, I'm sorry, even being on the same level would feel like a step back, but this isn't on the same level to begin with. And it showed. Croc 2 didn't perform nearly as well, which was expected to some extent, but the performance was weak enough that the series was gonna struggle to go much further than 2 games. At least that's what you would assume before you clicked this video, but the next game in the Croc series still trucked on through development, ideally learning from Croc 2's mistakes, and oh my god, they somehow copied Croc 2's awful jump in a side-scroller. What the fuck? The next game after Croc 2, believe it or not, is Croc 1, a 2000 Game Boy Color release that acts as a sort of alternate timeline retelling of the first game's story, a bold way to expand the Croc cinematic universe. This version was only partly developed by Argonaut, with Fox Interactive slating a different studio to handle the project and Argonaut taking more of an oversight role. See, at this point the studio was busy finishing up the 3 years too late movie tie-in game to 1997's Alien Resurrection, another game published by Fox Interactive, and incidentally, the very first-person shooter with modern 2-stick aiming controls. Like, ever. The first FPS that used dual analog controls as we know them today was a licensed Alien game that went through 3 years of development hell and came out well after the film was no longer relevant. Just wanted to throw that fun fact out there, Argonaut is wild. And why did this game come out so late? Well, perhaps because Croc 1 and 2 took so much extra time than they anticipated, so you could say that Croc directly led to the entire modern FPS genre. When it comes to Croc Game Boy Color, I was pretty surprised at how faithful this game is to a lot of the structure featured in both Croc 1 and 2, though don't take surprised as a good thing. The jump arc is once again kind of painful, but Croc GBC at least restructures the health and live systems to be far more favorable to the player. For the very first time in the Croc series, I cannot believe this is a series, extra lives are everywhere, and instead of the gems being sonic rings, you only lose a set amount when hit by different enemies. The Donkey Kong Country-esque water levels especially, man, you want to talk about cameras that make your stomach turn? Whew. Croc GBC also really enjoys putting your green character and a bunch of green enemies on a green background very early on, which is just mwah. However, as an odd curiosity of a game, I kind of appreciate that it exists. The story and boss setups are more or less the same as in the first Croc game. You're still trying to save all the Gobbos in each level, and the game even has 5 hidden letters in every level that spell bonus and unlock the same sort of special gate at the end, just like in the other Croc 1. The bonus letters themselves are even a sort of callback to the early versions of the original Croc 1, where the 5 colored crystals were instead going to be the 5 bonus letters. And you know what? Croc GBC does have Ballistic Meg, so I guess I can't be too critical of the game. Following Croc's Game Boy attempt is Croc 2 on the game. I don't know what I expect, except this version of Croc 2 is a top-down, Zelda-styled adventure game? Okay, I think I can get behind this. No, actually, I cannot. It turns out taking Croc 2's very long levels and converting them into a semi-puzzle adventure format actually makes a lot of the levels longer. What a shock. And hearing this game's subpar tracks looping again and again makes me wish we had Croc 1's soundtrack back. No, the other one. And thanks to a fascinating combination of the crunched Game Boy Color screen, along with Croc himself being very large compared to each screen in-game, there's a lot of meandering through these samey-looking pathways trying to figure out which areas you've been to already in each level, where the objective actually might be, and now that I'm saying all this, I realize this game actually is pretty faithful to Croc 2, so I guess kudos. I do enjoy the idea behind this version, because really the mission objectives in Croc 2 lended themselves better to this sort of format, and solid Zelda clones are hard to come by. This did not make them easier to come by. As a fun fact, this was the very first Croc game not to have Argonaut's hands involved in some way, with Fox instead tasking Natsume with developing the project because I guess they really wanted that Croc show to happen. The Croc show, as you can probably guess, did not end up happening. Supposedly, there were some full episode scripts written, and I'm guessing the numbers continued cratering with these games sales-wise, and Fox realized that they might be propping up a corpse in a Weekend at Bernie's situation. By the way, Weekend at Bernie's? Inspired by Croc. I will say, if nothing else, this version does split your lives off from your heart containers, which I would appreciate far more if most of the damage you take here wasn't from bottomless pits due to the bad platforming perspective, and if bottomless pits didn't instantly take a life away anyway. This game sucks. Now here's where things with Croc and Argonaut get even more fascinating. In the mid-2000s, Argonaut began struggling due to the massive expansion of game development costs to the point that it eventually folded entirely. Owner Jez San had the funds to at least keep together 2 branches of the company, so he picked the mobile game division Morpheme and Ninja Theory. You know, Heavenly Sword, Hellblade, bought by Microsoft, that studio? Yeah, they were owned by Argonaut. What a weird company. Sadly, this doesn't mean we ever got a Croc hack-and-slash game. We'll just have to hold out hope that Croc 15 on the Xbox Series X2 does that. Instead, we're looking over to Morpheme, who produced 3 Croc games for Java phones between 2005 and 2006. One of them is just a single pinball table, so I'm gonna go ahead and get that out of the way right now, but the other 2 are isometric puzzle games where the goal is to traverse these diorama-style levels, collect crystals, and save Gobbos yet again. I could make a joke about how game director Shinya Hiratake thanked Morpheme for inspiring Captain Toad's gameplay, but at this point, I'm dead inside. Putting aside the weird control issues that naturally come with emulating an old keypad Java phone game with a weird hybrid mouse and keyboard setup because the controls on Java phone emulators sometimes just don't work. Fun fact, by the way, I was playing this game on a fucking DualSense at one point, but then it stopped working. Just saying that this game is playable with a controller. Wow. These 2 games in the Croc Mobile series are genuinely pretty fun. Well, maybe not the second one either. The emulator really did not like Croc Mobile Volcanic Panic, that is the real name of this game, or this game just has some issues. These 2 games are essentially identical, minus some really loud sound effects and music that blast in the second game, and also, even glitches aside, Croc Mobile 2 just looks worse for some reason. But functionally, these are just the same game with different levels. Like with every Croc game at this point, both of these have some bit of platforming jank. In this case, sometimes the perspective really messes with you when you jump into the abyss thinking you're actually lined up with a platform below, but what are you gonna do? Really, the only times I ended up getting annoyed were when the game decided to throw platforms that sink underneath you, forcing you to press the 5 key to jump multiple times in a row in rapid succession, and those inputs just never felt reliable even when I wasn't under a very tight time pressure. Both Jungle Rumble and Volcanic Panic feature 16 levels split across 2 worlds, and each level contains 9 crystals to find and 1 Gobbo child to save from Baron Dante once again. Gotta say, it's remarkable that we're now 7 games into the Croc cinematic universe, and Baron Dante has been the villain in every single one, yes, even Pinball. Also, because I know you are wondering this, you can make an argument that these 2 games here are Croc 3 and 4 in terms of the narrative arc. The level layouts are pretty imaginative, and sometimes they're surprisingly tricky puzzles to crack. I mean, half the time that's because of the isometric angle throwing you off, but I'm trying to be positive here. Far and away the best part about either of these games, Jungle Rumble in particular, is the straight-up hilarious dialogue. Because this is a phone game, Croc naturally has a phone, so in every level he'll receive calls from the Gobbo child he's trying to save because the Dantinis didn't remember to take the prisoners' phones away. Well, that, or I guess they might be respecting the right to 1 phone call. Also, yes, Dante's minions are called Dantinis, except in Croc Mobile 2, where they are Fem-teenies. I just have to highlight that. I'm sorry. The text from these calls here tend to be pretty funny, but it's nothing compared to the stuff in the overworld at the start of Jungle Rumble. So the Gobbos aren't one entity anymore, they all have individual names, and they're either so out of place or I'm so tired that I just kept cracking up at each new one that appeared. I mean, for one, Croc just keeps yelling at all of them to stop crying, and he gets more aggressive as time goes on, but even beyond that, here are some select gems. Zora, Mark, Jenna, Bambini, Spoonie, Paulo, or the one that just absolutely broke me, Hi Croc, it's me, Jerry. Welcome to the jungle. Guns N' Roses later thanked Morpheme for the inspiration behind their hit song, Don't Cry. The lyrics needed a bit of workshopping because Croc really just starts getting mean about it, but hey. Believe it or not, Croc was still pushing units at this point, with Jungle Rumble somehow hitting over 100,000 sales despite having 0 marketing. Use that as ammo in your Bring Back Croc hashtags, you weirdos. Even in spite of those sales, Croc 4 Volcanic Panic, at least for now, concluded the main series of Croc games, an epic 7-game run that eclipsed anything seen in media before or since. With Argonaut dissolved, Morpheme and Ninja Theory eventually made their way out into the wild. The latter, as I already said, is now owned by Microsoft, and the former was acquired by IDOS and ended up producing some Hitman games with this same Croc engine for Java phones. So yes, somehow, Croc actually did inspire Agent 47, no E3 convention meeting needed for that one. Jez San, to this day, retains the IP rights over the Croc series, and he's used it well by getting into the online poker market and apparently buying a lot of Bitcoin very early on. Where's my Croc coin? However, this somehow isn't where the story ends, as there is another. You've all probably seen him, you've all questioned him, but it's time to meet him and enter his world. Let me introduce you to Croc. Now hold on, I hear some of you saying, but Jonathan, Croc's world is a totally different series, it's not even related to Croc. To which I'll respond, my name is Kevin. Yeah, that's what I thought. Croc's World is the 8th game in the CCU, exploring another splinter dimension where Croc was never abandoned by his parents, a world without Gobbos, a world where this legally ambiguous, questionable copyright infringement of a character has had 6 games produced by some German guy who makes a bunch of knockoff smartphone apps. Alright, look, you've all been curious about these at some point if you know anything whatsoever about Croc. Somebody's gotta talk about them, and I spent a whole $4 buying each of these games on PSN, only to realize they're free on the Windows Store. Just let me have this, okay? Croc's World is split into 3 distinct eras. There's Classic Era Croc's World, featuring Croc's World 1, 2, and 3. There's the Modern Era Croc's World, a much faster-paced saga of games, including, and actually limited to, a single Mario Run clone called Croc's World Run, and then there's the Postmodern Era Croc's World, the Impressionist Era, in that there are 2 games that are doing a bad impression of Super Mario Maker. Croc's World 1 and 2 share a very similar format, just like each of the duologies of Croc that came before, except now that I say that, probably the Game Boy ones don't share that. You know, f*** you, okay? Both games contain 2 worlds that house 30 levels each. Every world has an above-ground and underground level theme that alternates from level to level, with my favorite being the desert, as if you pay attention to the deep lore in this series, you'll see that there are 2 suns on screen at the same time, meaning that this variant of the Croc universe takes place on planet Tatooine. The games are simple side-scrollers, so simple in fact that the entire series has one single song in its entire soundtrack across 6 games, a song that carries through between levels and pauses for just long enough before looping all over again every single time that you think maybe, just maybe, God has granted your wish, you've finally died and your suffering has at last ended. But no, you are Prometheus. Croc's world is the rock to which you're tied as punishment for your sins against Zeus, and this single looping song is the eagle that will continue to tear at and consume your regenerating body day after day after day for eternity. There is no escape. This is your life now. Neat! And speaking of rocks, Croc's world features a number of really cool power-ups, including a bag of rocks that you throw at enemies, a helmet that lets you crush stone blocks above you, and in later games, a bag of magic blue rocks that seek out enemies and destroy them with a homing attack. I can't promise there's not a Breaking Bad joke about magic blue rocks in there somewhere, but I don't care. That said, if you want more proof that Croc's world is canon to the Croc cinematic universe, you collect colored gems throughout this series, and every 100 gems gives you an extra life just like in Croc Prime. In fact, getting a game over in Croc's world is also just as meaningless as in Croc Prime. Croc's World 2 also introduces some awesome new features such as slopes, some other power-ups like a fireman hat that lets you touch fire, speedy shoes, and invincibility power-ups later seen in games like Sonic 1, and Croc's World 3 introduces an amazing new feature inspired by its predecessor Croc's World Run that I like to call worse gameplay. Also, a kangaroo that controls exactly the same as Croc. My absolute favorite thing about the Croc's World universe, though, easily, is that its levels are really an allegory for life. Sometimes you get to the end, and it just stops. There's nothing, it just ends. It's beautiful, in a way. And then there are the 2 Croc's World construction kit games, one of which came out in early 2022, meaning that this series is alive and not well. Here you can create, share, and play thrilling levels such as Jeremy. The most popular level in one of these games is Jeremy. Croc's World Construction Kit 2, all jokes aside, has some pretty creative level ideas thanks to a bunch of new boss and enemy types that weren't in any of the games prior as far as I'd seen. The wall jump that only appeared in Croc's World Run is here finally as well. There's a baby Croc that plays differently and is probably this universe's actual Croc, like a Donkey Kong, Cranky Kong situation where the Croc that we've played for all of Croc's World was actually the grandfather of the Croc we know from the Prime Croc universe, which means that these 6 games actually might all have been prequels to Legend of the Gobbos. That would explain why Baron Dante doesn't appear in any of these games, as well as he hasn't yet broken the seal on the realm that he's been trapped in. I think I've actually gone insane. In other words, the definitive Croc timeline goes as such: Croc's World 1, Croc's World 2, Croc's World Run, Croc's World 3, Croc's World Construction Kit 1, Croc's World Construction Kit 2, Croc Legend of the Gobbos and Croc Game Boy as parallel alternate retellings, Croc 2 and Croc 2 in the same vein, Croc Mobile Jungle Rumble, Croc Mobile Pinball, and finally, Croc Mobile Volcanic Panic. 13 games, a story left unfinished, and a missing 14th Croc game to answer the question, what did Croc do after Croc 2's ending, when he reunited with his crocodile family? Well, early in the Xbox days, Argonaut briefly pitched a Croc 3, wherein Croc would be the elder statesman of his tribe, training the other young Crocs up to prepare for Baron Dante's inevitable return. I'm assuming it'd be Dante at least, because they haven't built up any other villains. Who else would it be, Virgil? Just as Croc's own grandfather Croc had done in the Croc's World games, he would develop the next era of Croc, or something. The game was pitched to Microsoft as a game that would feature not only a single-player story, but 2-player and 4-player co-op, perhaps even online multiplayer. This pitch never saw the light of day, as Argonaut's downfall had already begun well before this point. You could even argue the downfall began the moment they pitched Croc 1, Yoshi Racing, to Nintendo. That was the moment that their fortunes began to change, that they went from ever so briefly being at the very forefront of gaming to racing from behind and taking on licensed projects to try and keep afloat. At one point, Argonaut was just 12 young guys working from a single house, and in an instant, they became superstars, owning a shared company with Nintendo with the express intent of developing hardware together, hardware that almost ended up being natively built into every Super Nintendo console sold in the West. hardware that gave a preview at the near future of console gaming, the very same preview that eventually boxed Argonaut, its own wildly instrumental, ahead-of-its-time developer, out of its once-in-a-lifetime, one-in-a-million partnership with, at the time, the tightest-lipped and most powerful company in the industry. Nobody would have thought it at the time, but this early demo for Croc was the beginning of the end. Jez San has said multiple times that it's likely one day he'll push for a Croc remake or revival of some sort since fans ask him so frequently and fervently. In a world full of second or third chances like Yooka-Laylee, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, that one kangaroo game that's not Croc's World 3, and countless others, who's to say Croc can't have another go? Even if you may have your doubts, this little reptile has always been the underdog, the scrappy fighter that you can't help but root for, the quirky one that you'll always try to appreciate even though maybe he struggles to live up to expectations. In many ways, Croc mirrors its developer Argonaut, a studio that had all the pieces and all of the potential but simply ended up being so ahead of its time that it ended up living in the wrong time and falling behind. While it's likely that there will be a 7th Croc's World game well before Croc Prime gets a chance to shine once more, I don't think it's a book we should close just yet. I think there's room for the oft-forgotten legend of Croc to include a new chapter, a new beginning. Even as disappointing as each of these games ended up being, even with the near misses of the series' potential, if we do get a Croc 14, I'll be there cheering it on. After all, who doesn't love a good underdog story? And yes, in case you're keeping score, I did just get you invested in the ending of this story after spending several minutes shitposting about some smartphone shovelware. Hit that goddamn subscribe button. Thank you.
I've been asking for it for years. You're gonna give me what I want, or I'm gonna continue to hurt people you love. Give me what I want.
As always, I'd like to give a very special thanks to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon, including the crew that's trying to kill me by making me do this in one breath, such as Goldstorm07, Anon42, Cloudy Boy, Jump Rock, Kerrigane564, Malcavio, Philly D360, Phyrexian, Sleeper Agent, Rodney220, the FOE3, The Critic of Innocence, Arlen B, Calico Plus, Captain Squid, Eclipse 2025, Epo90, Even Luck, Faisal B, Harry, Heidi, Hotzi, I Pay My Cam Girls, So Why Not You, Ibathon, James Boss, Justin Gregoire, okay, I didn't do it in one breath, famous Twitch streamer JTart9, Lupine Pariah, Philip E, Shadow Nexus, Stefan, Tabriz Sadiq, The Milkman, Terminally Nerdy, Wayne is Boss, William Bundy, and Buckles Chucklow. If you'd like access to early and ad-free videos, you want to join the Golden Cult on Discord, it's not a cult, I promise maybe, or other perks, visit patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. Or don't, I'm not your dad yet. Go watch another video or something. If you spent 45 minutes watching this, you probably got time for more. Much love, and as always, until next time, stay golden.